So two more topics. Well, emotions, which is going to lead us into suicide, and drugs. So, I really hate that adolescence ends on topics that are not necessarily the easiest or the most positive, but these are realities in our children's lives, and so we have to be aware of them and look at them. So what are the most difficult emotions for teens? Dip in self-esteem at puberty is found for children of every ethnicity and gender. We have talked so much about why that could happen and how that could happen. Clinical depression, feelings of hopelessness, lethargy, and worthlessness that last 2 weeks or more. Everybody is going to go through ups and downs. Everybody is going to have difficulties and hard times. And yes, especially in adolescence, we can be dramatic and it can feel chaotic and it can be difficult. But clinical depression does have the 2 week sort of marker. We see a lot more of it in our teens, a lot because of those hormones and the pruning of the brain and the HPA axis, and how healthy is it coming into adolescence, and then how is it going to do when we get there and we go through these different things. Rumination, repeatedly thinking and talking about past experiences, can contribute to depression and is more common in girls. I don't think that's probably a big shocker. But I do know that, our boys can go through that too, in terms of just thinking over and over and over again about something, getting caught and trapped in those stories. What could have happened, would have happened, should have happened, going to happen, might happen. What I said, what I did, all of that. Those are the stories. And this is so much why I wish, and it's happening. We're getting mindfulness more in all levels of schooling. It's, of course, not happening fast enough for me. But I think that this is what we really work with when we work with mindfulness, is some of that rumination. Now, when it comes to suicide, suicidal ideation, thinking about suicide, usually with some serious emotional, intellectual, or cognitive overtones. Ideation is common. So completed suicides are not, but ideation is common, and I think, honestly, it wouldn't hurt us to tell teens that it's not weird or off the mark to have moments of thinking, God, it would be so much easier not to have to do all this, or just feeling overwhelmed by the pressures, by the societal, the physical, all the things that are going on, teaching teens this information about themselves. It's why, Siegel's book Brainstorm is wonderful, because it's written for teens as well as for parents, helping them to understand their own brains and bodies, and that some of it can lead to this. That emotional spark can sometimes lead to ideation. And I almost hate to use the word normal for it, but I think for teens, normalizing that and knowing that just even flash thoughts of that, don't mean that there's something deeply and seriously wrong with you, though it may mean that, yes, we need to look at what's going on emotionally. Why are these thoughts coming in? What is happening? And not keeping that such a hushed thing around teens in terms of that, because it's that hushness that then can lead to completions, even though adolescents are less likely to complete suicide than adults. I had a student once that said about, just said that we hear so much about teen suicide, yet we don't hear a whole lot about adult suicide. And, knew some adults who had done this. And so I tend to think that it makes news when it's a teen more, but I also think that for teens, there's more eyes on teens. There's more, we feel the tragedy of it so deeply when it's a young person, but certainly it's as deep when it happens to an adult and in their circle. But I think there are so many eyes on teenagers within a school system. It's probably the time we have the most peers around us of any time in our lives, is in our adolescence and emerging young adulthood. That it's just, and it happens less often maybe because there are those eyes on, and somebody can pick it up sometimes more than the adults. Parasuicide, any potentially lethal action against the self that does not result in death, cutting can be considered parasuicide, because it could be lethal. It could be, and it's meant to harm the self. Common completed parasite suicide is more common than completed, more common in girls than boys. Now, I looked up, there's more information on this than what we get. So I think I have. Okay, so gender suicide rate among male teenagers is 4 times higher than the rate of female teenagers. I think I have more about that. Anyway, why? Well, the male culture shames those who attempt suicide but fail. That's an idea that, and this may just be kind of some of the cognitive messages that boys are raised with over girls, that it would be more sort of embarrassing or shaming to try and not complete. Males tend to shoot themselves. Females swallow pills or hang themselves. So this is where rumination actually might save some of our girls. Girls tend to ruminate. They ruminate, they also talk to their friends. They ruminate with each other. And because they can be more expressively emotional, they might get seen more in that. While boys, when they get serious about this, tend to withdraw. And so we don't notice it, or they hide it better than the girls do. So this is more sort of updated information. Methods in the U.S., firearms, guns. Studies reveal that guns are, traditionally, guns have been the number one form of suicide. Studies reveal that guns are much more likely to be in the homes of those who complete suicide, and that if a gun is in a home, it is highly likely to be used as the method. So firearms are the number one traditional method. Hanging or suffocation, number 2. Self-poisoning, number 3. More recently, the CDC found that there has been a rise in hanging as the method for suicide among females. From 2003 to 2004, it has increased for ages 10 to 14 and age 15 to 19 by 119% and 44%. Ethnicity in the U.S., rates of attempted and completed suicide are highest among Native Americans. White youth have traditionally had higher suicide rates than non-whites, but that gap is decreasing because there is an increase among African American males. I think the whole conversation about suicide, whatever it is, it's, we have war on drugs, we have war on this, where's the war on suicide? And the thing with what I believe about the war on drugs, and the reason it doesn't, is that we have to go to the why. Why do people use drugs? Why do people commit suicide? That is where you fight a war, is at the why. And you have to go to the very base, you have to go to the levels, and what's going to really help children. So you have to start younger. And certainly by high school, be talking to children about stress, giving them coping mechanisms that work, helping them understand their brains and their bodies and these emotions, and how to manage them and deal with them and be with them. Because I think, especially if we look back at the idea of the personal fable, this is the worst thing in the whole world. And it's harder when we're teens to see. I mean, I can remember thinking, my God, 30 is so old. And certainly by the time I'm 30, I'll have everything figured out. And so for some, even thinking to that horizon of another day, that there could be another happy day in the world, can at the moments be so just overwhelming and drowning that they can't look beyond that. So I think that we have to begin teaching these coping mechanisms. These are the skills that are missing in our school system. And we say, well, parents should teach them. Well, how many of your parents knew them? Mine didn't. And so we have to begin giving young people an opportunity to engage their neuroplasticity, engage their pruning mechanisms, engage these things in the brain that allow them to build healthier HPA systems, healthier stress and management systems. I mean, I think that is what all of this information leads us to. According to a 2009 journal article, The Epidemiology of Youth Suicide and Suicidal Behavior, suicide is the third leading cause of death among young people in the U.S. I believe the text being used right now says that there is a decrease. Yet this particular article, though, said suicide rate among children and adolescents in the U.S. has increased dramatically in recent years. So there's going to be different information, different places, and has been accompanied by substantial changes in the leading methods, which we already talked about. Wealth and education decrease the incidence of many disorders, but not suicide. And if we think about that, sometimes it's the students who have so many high expectations put upon them, have so many opportunities and resources, and the expectations and the pressures are so high. I have seen this in kids I've worked with, that they're just as likely, if not more so sometimes, to feel that if they cannot deal with the pressures and nobody is supporting them and even having pressures, but just continues to push them, sometimes it pushes them over the edge. A difficult topic, but one to be aware of. And again, how do we help our young people? How do we help ourselves? First, to begin to deal with the stress that leads to the depression, that leads to such a narrowing of choices that we come to this one. I think that's the valid question. I'd love to hear what you think. All right, so moving on to delinquency and disobedience. What causes teens to break the law and move into delinquency? Well, what I want, increased anger during puberty is normal. But most express their anger in acceptable ways. But if we look back over the course of this entire course and we look at emotional regulation and how emotional regulation is taught and modeled, especially for students, kids maybe who have a hard time with it, that, that's beginning in the 2 to 6 time. Well, we're building the architecture of it in 0 to 2. And we're really beginning to deal with aggression in 2 to 6. And so how has it over time, in the course of time, been dealt with? How have students learned how to deal with aggression and anger and these kinds of things? And what are their coping mechanisms? What is being modeled for them? What is their lens of possibility? How wide is it for themselves? What are the messages they're being given? So, these are all the things. I'm always going to kind of go back to that answer. But but just know these two terms. There's the life course persistent offender, a person whose criminal activity typically begins in early adolescence and continues throughout life. This is a career a career criminal. Life course persistent offender. Life course for the life. Adolescence limited offender. Criminal activity stops by age 21. Hoping that they don't do something that gets them in juvenile detention that could then change the whole course of their lives. But there are many who, maybe they steal, maybe they do something when they're young. They do these even like what they consider as pranks, or they steal a car, they go joyriding or drink underage. That's even something like that when they're young. But by the time they've graduated or they've gotten into college, they've left that behind. Certainly by the time they've left college. All right, so our last topic in adolescence, drug use and abuse. Drug use becomes widespread from age 10 to 25. A lot of this is text. I'm going to move to the information because we talk about drugs later too. So I'm just going to do a little bit of this stuff that more updated information. Monitoring the Future is a long-term study of American adolescents, college students, and adult high school graduates through age 55. 2015 report key findings. Declining use in a number of licit, legal, and illegal substances. Cigarette and alcohol show significant declines, reaching their lowest levels in the history of the study. Students who at any time in their lives, and what they kind of call that as lifetime prevalence. Students who at any time in their lives had smoked tobacco declined between 2014 and 2015 in all 3 grades. That's 8th, 10th, and 12th that they looked at. 30% 13% in 8th, 20% in 10th, 31 in 12th. Perceived risk is named as a large contributor. So smoking is going down. Something that we're doing about smoking, how we're sort of showing students the risk of smoking is working at some level to continue, but we still have 31% in 12th graders who at some point or another have smoked. It's not an insignificant amount. Illicit drugs. Use at any point in the past year, which is called annual prevalence, declined for synthetic marijuana, heroin, MDMA, ecstasy or Molly, sedatives, and non-medical use of any prescription drug. So those particular ones in annual prevalence, their use declined. Now, annual prevalence of using any illicit drug remained basically unchanged in 2015. Now, that stability, give me one moment. Okay, so that stability of the use of illicit drugs in general is primarily due to the fact the annual prevalence of marijuana, which tends to drive the overall index, showed rather little change in 2015. Annual prevalence of marijuana was down by just 0.4 percentage points to 23.7. So that's a combined total of the grades. Although the use of marijuana remained essentially unchanged, marijuana attitudes among students continued to move toward greater acceptance. Perceived risk of smoking marijuana regularly declined in all 3 grades, significantly so in 12th grade. So what this says is, though we haven't, that it didn't show a huge jump in the use, still at almost 1 out of 4 average between the 3 grades, though, I don't know, for me, this is still, these are still high numbers. We see that it's continually shifting the attitude, that smoking pot isn't seen as a risk. I'm going to have a lot to say about that later. But we know that because as it becomes legal in more places and so forth, then our young people get the idea that it's not a risk. Okay. Let's look at some of the harm, though. Tobacco slows down growth, reduces the appetite, can damage developing hearts, lungs, brains, and reproductive systems. Certainly we know it can cause lung cancer. And it can cause gum cancer, lip mouth things if it's too, there's different things that tobacco can certainly cause problems. Alcohol is the most, I thought I had more about alcohol. I think I have something. Most frequently abused drug among North Americans. Let's look at this one. In 2015, the proportions of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders who reported drinking an alcoholic beverage in the 30-day period prior to the survey were 10, 22, and 35 respectively. So 10% for 8th graders, 22 for 10th, and 35 for 12th graders. There is no evidence of any displacement effect between alcohol and marijuana, a hypothesis that we frequently hear. That is, marijuana use goes up, alcohol use goes down, or, the one's displacing the other. The 2 drugs have moved much more in parallel over the decades than in opposite directions, at least until about a 5-year period in the 2000s, during which alcohol continued to decline while marijuana reversed course and rose. These 2 behaviors have consistently been positively correlated at the individual level. So for an individual, usually they're positively, when one rises, the other rises. What we see happening. So alcohol is the number one, among young people, kind of certainly a gateway drug. Inhalants are kind of that, and smoking always was for a long time, but certainly alcohol. Heavy drinking can impair memory. Oh, I'm sorry, hold on. So, alcohol impairs memory, self-control, which is going to feed into the whole risk-taking factors that we see in young people. Damages the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, so logic is going to go down. Alcohol allows momentary denial, which can have consequences. Okay, marijuana. We're going to talk more about marijuana later. But Adolescents who regularly smoke marijuana are more likely to drop out of school, become teenage parents, and be unemployed. Affects memory, language proficiency, and I think the big one is motivation. What we see in people who continually use marijuana, because it's such kind of a chill out kind of thing, is that what it can do is undermine our own reward and motivation systems. It can really dampen that motivation, and it gets into the reward system, and it kind of takes the place of our own systems in that case. And then it's really hard to get ourselves motivated to really go out there and, and do the things we want to do in life. So we'll talk more about that one though later. So drug use and abuse are different risky behaviors more common for boys than girls, and vice versa. Most adolescent drug use has decreased in the U.S. since 1976. Gender differences. The various gender differences in substance use appear to emerge from many drugs as students grow older. In 8th grade, females have higher rates of use for some drugs, such as inhalants and amphetamines. Prevalence rates for both genders then increase with age, with the single exception of inhalants. I think that one kind of just goes down for all kids, but the increase is sharper among males. So over time, and certainly with the types of drugs, we definitely see greater frequency with males than females, reinforced by social constructions about proper male and female behavior. So in peer pressure and kind of social cred and all that kind of stuff. So we do see by 12th grade males using more often. Drug use is progressive. First use is usually social. Preventing it, what works? So we know that it's going to excite the limbic system. It can interfere. We can get, abuse is so easy because of that low dopamine, high reward system kind of counterbalance thing that's going on. And, so what's going to work? We've tried massive ad campaigns, have worked in Florida and California, changing the social context. I think changing the social context is probably big at this time. I personally, of course, am always going to go back to teaching mindfulness and coping skills, because I think in the end, a lot of this is either about kind of fitting in or coping. And when we have no skills, these types of skills can, one, they help us fit in. And then two, they take away whatever it is that the pressure that we have. And three, they make us feel good. And so then why not? That's easy. It's kind of an easy go-to. It's a lot harder to sit around and meditate every day alone or even with a group when, and if it's not thought to be cool. But I think that we have to sort of change the social context of what's cool and what's not to some extent. And that goes to kind of my own ideas about this. Scare tactics do not help, especially because they're just showing risk-taking, which adolescents kind of feed on. So that kind of goes down the drain. I think that we have to sort of use for the best these ideas of the essence of adolescence. How do we get them? How do we build them up? How do we build up their emotional systems, their coping mechanisms? How do we hook into their passions and their courage and their innovations and their imagination and their need for connection in positive ways? And how do we build that for our kids? And we've got to give them something other than the drugs to turn to. I usually wait to do this, and you'll hear me say it again. But here's my thing, as a teacher who teaches mindfulness and who believes very much in the need to build up these skills for emotional intelligence in our youth and in ourselves as adults, I would be a hypocrite if I tried in any way to downplay what I think the risks of drugs are, because I think that the biggest risk is that it takes us away from our life and from being in it and engaging in it and being real. And, that's what mindfulness tries to give us. a way to be in the moment and be okay in the moment and build up our brains in ways that grow our capacities to be with life and to up our joy and down regulate our stress and in ways that drugs are never going to do. They're going to take us away from our life. They might help us connect in a moment, but in the morning it's all the same. So anyway, that's kind of that. So we've got our young, and they have some beautiful things about them in ways that they're growing, and they've got some real challenges to be worked with, to build upon, to build those brains at this time. And it's a lot of the adults in their lives and around them that need this knowledge to create constructs in school and at home that help them use those brains the best that they can. All right. Until next time.